So thank you, Calcutta Research Group, and thank you, Poshali in particular, because Poshali has been very consistent in reminding me of the deadlines. Uh, anyway, first I will start with an apology. Uh, this talk is not going to be about the cities or the urban question for 90% of its time. In the first, I have 10 slides. The first 9 slides, actually, I'm going to talk about this category of rent. And then in the final slide, and I'm thinking of spending more time on that slide, in which I would like to ask certain questions. And the first few slides, most of these, the 7, 8 slides that I have in the beginning, would hopefully lead to these questions in the final slide. And again, as we talk, I am hoping that why I'm taking up rent as a category of analysis, or why I am actually suggesting to take up rent as a category of analysis in urban improvement should be clear by the end, by the time we end this presentation. So the first thing, initially, as I said in the first few slides, I'm going to talk about the holy or the unholy trinity of classical political economy: Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and of course Marx. And all three of them are very important thinkers on this question of rent. I think there are a couple of people who are in the audience who are trained in economics, and I'm guessing the rest are not. And I will try to make as much sense as possible. I think I have mentioned in the abstract that whenever we talk about rent, mostly the two things which we usually consider: one, it's a payment for the use of land, and second, mostly it is associated with the question of agriculture. At least that is how it was conceived initially during the writings of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. But although it's the question of rent, in fact, in common parlance, appears probably more frequently when we talk about renting a place in a city or renting a place anywhere. So rent in that sense has two meanings. In the academic sense, of course, it is mostly used in the context of payment paid for use of land. And as you can see in this, Adam Smith was somebody who actually suggested that for the first time. And secondly, in common parlance, in popular understanding, and in popular usage of the term, rent is often used as a payment for using a space. So we are going to consider both these usages. So first we start with Smith. So in Wealth of Nations, there is this chapter in book 1, chapter number 11, called Of the Rent of Land. And this is a quotation from that chapter. This is how the chapter starts. Smith says, rent considered as the price paid for the use of land is naturally the highest which the tenant can afford to pay in the actual circumstances of the land. In adjusting the terms of the lease, the landlord endeavors to leave him no greater share of the produce than what is sufficient to keep up the stock from which he furnishes the seed, pays the labor, and purchases and maintains the cattle and other instruments of husbandry, together with the ordinary profits of farming stock in the neighborhood. First of all, the word stock, it may sound a bit unfamiliar. In 18th century and also in the 19th century writings, the word stock usually is used to mean capital. So capital stock, Adam Smith is talking about capital stock. Now, two things should be clear from this definition. One is, of course, it is a price paid for the use of land. Specifically, it is the payment which is being made by the tenant to the landlord, because the tenant is somebody who doesn't own the land. It's the landlord who owns the land in a way. And this amount that the tenant is paying to the landlord is the amount for the use of that plot of land in which the tenant is harvesting. Now, that's point number one. Point number two is how much rent is going to be paid is being determined by market operations, or what Smith otherwise calls competition. So the natural amount of rent, which is the amount which is also the ideal amount of rent. Smith uses the term naturally or natural price, mostly in the context of what today we call the equilibrium price or the highest market price. So when Smith says that it is naturally the highest, he's using the term in that sense. He's using the term naturally in that sense. So it's the naturally highest which the tenant can afford to pay, which means that the tenant will not be left with any money other than to pay for the other expenses of agriculture. All the rest will go to the landlord. And in that sense, later on in the chapter, he will say, the rent of the land, therefore, considered as the price paid for the use of land, is naturally a monopoly price. So, in Adam Smith's understanding, the landlord is entitled to rent because it's simply not because the landlord is owning the land. It's because landlord is the only person who has any stake in the land. The landlord is the only person who has proprietorial control over the land. It is not at all, Smith says, proportion to what the landlord may have laid out upon the improvement of the land or to what he can afford to take, but to what the farmer can afford to give. Now, it is very interesting. What Adam Smith is trying to suggest is that it's not really the landlord may try to extract as much as possible, but Adam Smith is also very mindful of the ability of the tenant to pay the amount of rent, and he's saying that he's arguing that it depends on the tenant, but even though it depends on the tenant is not in a bargaining position. The tenant has to pay that amount which is the highest possible for them. So now from this idea we get a theory of rent as a monopoly payment paid for the use of land. So far so good, I'm hoping. Okay, now let's move to Ricardo. Now, when we come to Ricardo, it becomes a little more complicated than that, because when we were talking about Smith was mostly talking about the common understanding or the most popular understanding of rent at the time in the late 18th century. Ricardo has published his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in 1870, so in the beginning of the 19th century. And in chapter 2, chapter 1 was on value, where he introduces the concepts of use value and exchange value, on which Marx will then write later. Chapter 2 is called On Rent. So you can see that rent is actually quite important to the Ricardian scheme of things, because for Smith, it wasn't as important. It's chapter 11 in book 1, which is the theoretical framework of Wealth of Nations. But for Ricardo, rent comes up to chapter number 2, because, and we shall talk about it, Ricardo actually wants to make a very important point here. So for Ricardo, and this is again a quote from the book, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, rent is that portion of the produce of the earth which is paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of the soil. It is often, however, confounded with interest and profit of capital, and in popular language, the term is applied to whatever is annually paid by a farmer to his landlord. So you can see that Ricardo is actually trying to distance his theory of rent from the popular understanding of the concept. And by popular, he also talks about Adam Smith. Adam Smith sometimes speaks of rent in the strict sense to which I am desirous of confining it, as Ricardo is saying, but more often in the popular sense. So what we saw in the previous slide, when we looked at how Adam Smith is talking about rent as the price paid for the use of land, Ricardo is referring to that rent is often understood in popular conception as a payment which is annually paid to the landowner or to the landlord. But Ricardo is much more interested in finding the logic of rent's existence. Why does rent exist? So for Smith, you can understand the rent kind of exists because of the reason that the landlord owns the land. That's it. Landlord has proprietorial control over this plot, and therefore rent exists. And there is now a contract between the landlord and the tenant, and the contract, the amount of rent is decided in the contract by the fact how much the tenant is able to pay. The highest amount that the tenant is able to pay will go to the landlord. So for the use of land, for the use of any plot of land in that sense, that is the Smithian understanding of rent. That one, this is a monopoly price which is being paid, which is coming from the tenant to the landlord, which in fact, if you think about it, it's true for the rent situation in any city as well. This is a tenant that the negotiation, when it happens between the tenant and the landlord, this is the principle on the basis of that happens, because the landlord is trying to extract as much rent as possible. Of course, the tenant is trying to avoid that and pay as little as possible, and that negotiation continues. So if we go by that route, that is the understanding. And then of course there is a contract which is signed between the tenant and the landlord, and the contract specifies the specific amount of rent, and of course annually the rent increases. So that's the situation, and that is something which Ricardo is arguing as a popular common understanding, and he wants to distance himself from this popular and common understanding, and is defining rent as something which is being paid not for the entire situation of the land, not for the productivity or the amount which is going to the output which is being produced in the land. This is just that portion of the total produce which is being paid to the landlord for the original and indestructible powers of the soil. Now, why does Ricardo want to distinguish between himself and Smith's understanding? Because according to him, which we find in the later paragraphs in this chapter, according to him, which he also says here, just starts talking about here, it's a mistake to confuse rent with profit or interest. Because for Ricardo, from the beginning, the attempt is to distinguish between the capitalist class and the older feudal order, the landlord class. And Ricardo wants the capitalist class to win this, class war in the British society and in the British economy also. So, in order to distinguish from the landlords to the capitalist class, to the industrialists of his time, Ricardo wants to separate rent very minutely from profit, because the profit goes to the capitalist class and rent goes to the landlord class. And in order to do so, he is putting his bet on a very simple state of nature in which the plot of land is found in the first instance, which is a situation where no capital investment has been put forward. This is a plot of land where no capital has been invested, because the moment capital is invested, the return on that capital will become profit, and that is supposed to go to the capitalist. But of course, when we talk about rent in common sense, and when we look at rent in plain sight, we don't make this distinction between capital being invested and that portion, that return of that portion going, because it's also very difficult in order to distinguish between the return which is coming from the capital which is being invested in land and the portion which will come from the original and indestructible productivity or fertility of land. So what Ricardo is actually doing is not really a very practical exercise, because in practicality, this is impossible to determine. But what Ricardo is suggesting is some kind of a conceptual distinction between profit and rent, which Smith was unable to do. So Ricardo wants to, as I said, introduce this conceptual distinction between rent and profit in order to also suggest this distinction between the two classes in the society, in the British society, the older and almost enfeebled feudal class, the class of feudal landlords, and the newly emerging and getting more powerful by day, the capitalist class, the industrial capitalist class. And for him, it is very important that the capitalist class wins this sort of race to become the most influential class in the British society and probably all over the world. And there also he suggests that, at the end of this chapter, he would recommend that the rent is actually dangerous for the society. The existence of rent is dangerous for the society, and the entirety of rent should be taxed, because rent ultimately eats into the profit. And how do we? So we actually, let me move to the next slide to talk very briefly about this concept called differential rent, which Ricardo introduces in this context. So you can see that there are different bars here. The first bar, uh, can you see the movement of the cursor? I'm moving it. Can you see it? Okay, thank you. So in the first case, where you can see that the plot of land is the most fertile, there, of course, the cost of labor, because of course it will need less labor than needed than in other cases, because the land is itself very fertile. And you will, of course, the capital investment, the amount of capital investment will also be quite less to get the exactly equal amount of produce in all these plots. So the first plot, where the fertility is the highest, then we move to the other plots where the fertility is slightly lower. The second plot, in the third plot, it's even lower than that. In the fourth plot, it's quite lower than the third plot. In the fifth plot, it's even lower than the fourth and the final plot, which is the lowest. And Ricardo argues that the price of the corn, or which is the produce, is being set at the last plot because the price has to be equal for all the plots. Otherwise, of course, the person who is cultivating the least fertile land will be out of the market. So that is not a possibility. So anyway, the price should be the same for all the plots. What is happening in the first 5 plots is that there is a gap between the price and the total cost of production, in like the total the sum of cost of capital and cost of labor, and that portion is being defined by Ricardo as something which is rent. Now you can see that when we move from the most fertile to the second most fertile land, the rent is actually low. And the third, and this, again, the rent is falling. And finally, in the final, the most or the least fertile plot of land, the rent is non-existent. It's only cost of capital and cost of labor, and the price is set at as a marginal price at the at that level, at the marginal plot of land. Now, the point that this would not be clear from this particular graph, but if you actually think of this graph in a different way, where the cost of capital and cost of labor, or the amount of labor and the amount of capital, would be the same if we assume that the amount of capital invested and the amount of labor employed are the same for all the plots, then of course you could see the produce in the least fertile land would be the least, and the produce in the most fertile land would be the highest. But the problem is that since the price is set at the margin, at the least fertile land, what will happen eventually? The portion, the profit, will actually fall, and rent will eat into most of the profit. Anyway, we can come to this point later during the question and answer session. It's a little bit complicated than the way I am describing here, and we can take it up later if we want. But so far, this is the understanding, the basic distinction between Smith and Ricardo, which we need to understand here to go on to Marx, is this. For Smith, this is a monopoly price, rent, which is coming from the monopoly control of the landlord over the piece of land, and it is being decided in a contractual agreement between the tenant and the landlord. For Ricardo, the origin of rent is more important than how it is actually practiced. He is making a conceptual distinction between profit and rent, and he's saying the rent is a payment which is made only for the original fertility, original productive powers of the land, and no part of the rent should be confused with any payment, any return on the capital which should be invested in the plot of land. But both Ricardo and Smith are actually unanimous on one point, that rent is a matter of the agrarian sector. Rent is something which is observed in agriculture. Because for Smith, of course, I mean, he is talking about the regular practice of the day where these rental agreements only happen between the tenant and the landlord in that way in the agrarian sector. But for Ricardo also, since he is talking about the fertility of land and rent being the effect of that fertility, of course, he is only interested in the question of the agricultural sector, and also the way he's making this distinction between profit and rent, from which he is drawing this distinction between the capitalist class and the agrarian feudal class. For him, this distinction between industry, which is governed by the logic of profit, and agriculture, which is governed by the logic of rent, should be maintained at any cost. Now, when we come to Marx, which he discusses in volume 3 of Capital, we see that Marx is actually trying to, and we shall say this, Marx is trying to combine both the views, because Marx doesn't want to give up on this monopoly price understanding of Smith. At the same time, Marx is very much interested in the question of differential rent. Although because of paucity of time, we are not going to discuss about the differential ground rent, the concept of differential ground rent that Marx offers. What we're going to talk about is the general theory of rent that Marx talks about in volume 3. But again, in the question and answer session, we can take it up. So now certain technical terms which we will encounter, which we have not found in Smith and Ricardo, because when Marx is writing Capital, and he's producing a critique of the political economy of his time, he was also using certain terms which were common, which were known to the readers of his time. At the same time, he's making certain changes in the definitions of these terms. So we have to go by the terms that Marx is using, but we should also talk about the terms which are equivalent, or the way we know these terms now. So Marx's theory of rent is based on, first of all, his concept of price of production, which is sum of cost price and average profit. So this price of production, Marx sometimes he refers to it as the average selling price or the market price. Price of production is basically what we also call the selling price, or in a way, it is the equilibrium price or the supply price, when the supply price or the demand price are intersecting, or the supply curve and the demand curve are intersecting, and supply price is equal to demand price. Basically, the price at which a commodity is being sold in the market is the price of production. And for Marx, it is the sum of cost price and average profit. What is cost price? Cost price depends on what Marx calls the organic composition of capital, which is the technical relationship of the employed labor power, which he calls variable capital, to the mass of the employed means of production, constant capital, which is basically a ratio of variable capital to constant capital. Variable capital, again, we can understand it. He is talking about labor, which is being invested in the capital itself, because labor is always in conjunction. Labor is used always in conjunction or in relationship with capital. Labor is not something which exists outside the circuits of capital. So labor, the ratio between labor power being employed in the production process and the capital which is being introduced, which is being used. So in Marx's theory, cost price depends on the organic composition of capital. It is the price of variable capital and constant capital. Variable capital and constant capital are always in a relationship of ratio. Sometimes the variable capital is higher than the constant capital. Sometimes the constant capital is higher than the variable capital. The capitalist, as Marx says, is always trying to maintain a perfect balance where the constant capital actually doesn't become heavier than the ratio doesn't become too favorable to constant capital, because that will lead to then falling rate of profit, and that would be the end of capitalism, because ultimately what the capitalist wants in Marx's understanding is to extract surplus from labor. So the amount of variable capital in the organic composition of capital should always be higher than the constant capital. But anyway, again, this is something that if we have time, we can talk about later. Now, individual firms have different cost prices. Of course, some of them will be higher than the average cost price of the industry, and some of them will have lower cost prices than the average in the industry, depending on their respective organic composition of capital. Let us say there is an industry, it's a cotton industry, and there are different firms, different companies. Now, you can see that probably you have thought that I have misspelled farm from FARM to FIRM. Now, this is the interesting part. This is the important move that Marx makes. So far, Smith and Ricardo were talking about farmland, the agricultural sector. But Marx's discussion of rent is actually a general discussion in which the capitalist mode of production is prevailing in both the agrarian sector and in the industrial sector. And ultimately, when he talks about rent, he actually only gives examples of the industrial sector. So and therefore, this discussion becomes even more relevant for the situation today. Now, in an industry, let's say cotton industry or any kind of industry, iron steel industry, there are individual firms, there are multiple firms which exist. Now, there is an industry average of cost prices. There is a what is socially necessary organic composition of capital which exists there in the industry, which is the average cost price, which is the average organic composition, of the general organic composition of capital within one particular industry. But the individual firms in that industry may have different cost prices depending on how their organic compositions of capital, how different their organic compositions of capital in their regular productive capacities, in their regular productive activities. Now, moving on from this, the price of production or market price of a commodity is determined by the average conditions of capital in the entire sphere of production. So first, we said that this theory of rent is based on its concept of price of production, which is sum of cost price and average profit. Now, the price of production of a commodity is determined by the average conditions of capital in the entire sphere of production, which means the price of production is a sum of the average cost price and the average profit. The price of production, which is, let's say, the industry price, because different firms are producing the same commodity within the same industry, but when that commodity is being sold in the market, because of competition, it would be sold at this price of production. This is constant price of, not constant, but one singular price of production. And that price of production will be determined by the average cost price and the average profit, which is the sum of average cost price and the average profit. If a commodity is largely produced with the help of a particular technology, and Marx gives this example of steam engine in this context, the cost price of few firms that use a natural waterfall, again Marx's example in the same paragraph, will be lower. Now, this is a very important point to understand. So, as I said, the price of production, which is also in a way the average price of the commodity, is determined by average cost price and average profit. The average cost price will be determined by the generally used prevalent technology which is used by most of the firms in a particular industry. But then there might be some firms which have the advantage of using, or which have the advantage of access to a particular natural resource like a waterfall. In that case, their cost price would be lower than the average. Why? Because a smaller quantity of labor is required for their production, namely less labor materialized in the constant capital, since no steam engine is being used. So as again, if you remember, what is the organic composition of capital? It's variable capital plus constant capital. Now here, in this case, the variable capital, variable labor would be less materialized in constant capital. So therefore, they have to pay less wages. So the cost price will fall. And that will mean that there will be a supra surplus profit, a surplus profit which would be more than the average profit. That gap between the profit, that is the average profit in the industry that is being enjoyed by most of the firms, and this extra profit, which is, and this larger profit, which is being enjoyed by few firms, which have some kind of access to certain natural resources. That is what Marx calls rent. So Marx again writes, this is a quote from volume 3, the chapter on rent, the chapter on the general theory of rent. This surplus profit arises from the greater natural power of production of labor in conjunction with some other natural power, which natural power is not at the command of all capitals in this sphere, whereas such a thing as the elasticity of steam is. Steam is available to everybody, but not this access to the waterfall. The application of this other natural power does not follow as a self-understood matter, whenever capital is invested in this sphere. It's not like this is something which is available to everybody. It is a monopolized natural power, which, like a waterfall, is only at the command of those who can avail themselves of a particular pieces of the globe and its opportunities. What is essentially happening here is actually Marx, as I said before, is bringing both Smith and Ricardo together. Remember, Smith talked about how rent was a monopoly payment and it's arising out of the landlord's monopoly control over land. But then Ricardo obviously had to get away from it because he wanted actually to question the right, this monopoly right of the landlord on land itself, because he wanted to get rid of the feudal order itself. So he tried to understand rent as something of kind of payment which is made for almost this non-existent original productive power or non-existent original fertility of land. Marx does two things at the same time. First, he wants to retain this notion of monopoly control or monopoly price or monopolistic nature of rent. At the same time, he doesn't want to let the power of Ricardo's argument about this access to something natural, something which is not available to everybody, this original, more fertile kind of situation of land, which is not available to everybody. That thing which is available to only a few even among the people, even among the capitalists, that is something which Marx wanted to retain in his idea of rent. And therefore, he is bringing both Smith and Ricardo together in this fascinating understanding. The second point is that he is kind of bringing rent or turning rent into a category which would be applicable not only for agriculture, but for the entire entire circuit of capitalist mode of production, agriculture and industry feeding into each other. So what are the implications? As I said, this is how Marx is moving a little away from Smith. Rent is not simply a contractual payment, which Smith was arguing. It is a product of private property because it arises out of this monopoly control. So if you look at Smith's discussion of rent, he hardly talks about how this monopoly control has come. Now, the moment Marx talks about this is a monopolized natural power, which is only at the command of those who can avail themselves of a particular piece of the globe, he is talking about private property. And there one can actually go back, of course, to his chapter on primitive accumulation in volume 1, where he's talking about the history of how private property was established in England. That's the first implication. Second implication, monopoly is not a market condition, as argued by Smith. It's not something that that will be part of a market negotiation where ultimately the tenant will be forced to pay the highest according to their highest capacity. That understanding is not what Marx wants to really put forward. He would actually argue that it is a social relationship in the sense that it is based on, again, the notion of private property, which is, of course, a social relationship. Now, what are the differences with Ricardo? These are the more important differences. One, of course, is natural power is not the source of rent. It is the material basis. For Ricardo, natural power is something which was the reason of the existence of rent. What Marx is arguing, that natural power is not natural in that sense, that it's not something which is outside of capital, which exists outside of capital, as Ricardo would argue. It's something which exists before capital was invested. Natural power is not prior to capital, but rather what Marx is arguing, that natural power is rather the material basis of the capitalist mode of production, in which the selective access to, or this whole idea of private property, which enables the selective access to certain natural resources, is the reason why rent is created. Second, the rentier class and the capitalist class are not each other's enemies. The capitalist class with natural advantage is better off even after paying rent. So in like one of the major implications of Marx's theory of rent is this: if the capitalist class and the landlord class come together, and if they kind of reach an agreement, then the capitalist class and both the classes will benefit from that agreement, which of course was not the case with Ricardo, because Ricardo assumed that the capitalist class and the rentier class would be always at each other's throat. This is something that I've already mentioned, that rent is not exclusive to agriculture. It operates in every sphere of production. Now, David Harvey, in Spaces of Capital, does talk about Marx's theory of rent. And I have certain issues with the way Harvey is reading this chapter. For example, for Harvey, a big question is Marx, or the point that he's making, that Marx has not talked about the land market in that sense. And Marx is more interested in the general character of rent and differential rent and all of that. Now, when it comes to Harvey to talk about the price of land or any piece of land, it can be agricultural land, it can be urban land, he defined that price as an accumulated interest on some imaginary capital. Rent is the expression of that interest. He's saying that the rent which is being paid, it is basically a kind of interest, and making the mistake, not mistake, but he's merging interest and rent, and he's not treating rent as a separate category, very different from interest on capital. He's saying that rent is a kind of interest, an accumulated interest on an imaginary capital. Why imaginary? Because the definition of capital is that it is a produced means of production. But land is not produced by labor. Capital is always produced by labor. But land is not produced by labor. Land already exists. So in that sense, it's fictitious or imaginary. It's not something which is created by capital. At the same time, it operates like capital in an economy, and it accrues interest, and that interest is basically known as rent. This is Harvey's definition. Now, we can actually critique this understanding with help of Marx. First of all, the way I read it, Marx shows that the capital is not imaginary. It is based on the prevalent technology of the time, socially abstracted in the form of the average rate of profit in the industry. The way Marx is discussing rent, he is not referring to any fictitious amount, any fictitious capital. And that is why for him, the question of land is not the foremost important question, but rather the access, the question of access, the concept of private property, which enables that access, and how that access itself becomes, in a way, a commodity, which of course then changes hand. And then through those exchange practices, a capitalist economy starts functioning. That is point number one. And the point number two is that it can only happen when there is an average rate of profit determined by the socially abstracted, socially necessary, the average rate of profit determined by the prevalent technology in the industry. Anybody who has recourse to that prevalent technology, but also has recourse to natural resources, therefore, will be at advantage. This is Marx's theory. So Marx's understanding, rent is not external, therefore, to the capitalist mode of production. Rather, it emerges due to the differences in the organic compositions of capital between two firms in the same industry. This observation helps us to frame the urban question in contemporary times. Now, this is the last slide. So now, this is the first three are the kind of observations I'm trying to make on the basis of this on the basis of the discussion that I've done so far. One is that I want to see the city as a site of extraction of surplus value. Point number two, rent as a framework enables me to understand extraction, which is extracting this margin between average surplus and a higher surplus induced by monopoly control over resources. And the third point is the socialization of the urban space depends on how the regimes of private property operate at the ground level. This is the first. I think the first two are kind of almost self-explanatory. The site as a city as a site of extraction of surplus value. In fact, any industrial sector can be thought as a site of, is thought as a site of extraction of surplus value, and city should not be any different. So all the productive activities within the city can be taken together to understand the city as a site of extraction of surplus value. That point is almost self-explanatory. Second point is a little more complicated than that, but I think we have established so far that if we use rent as a point of entry to understand this extraction, then it comes down to this question. Rent is this margin between average surplus and higher surplus induced by monopoly control over resources. When we use this definition, which of course we are borrowing from Marx, when we use this definition, then how do we understand this extraction? And there, my suggestion will be to historicize the processes of extraction over time. And the historicization can happen very interestingly in the line of how the regimes of private property within the urban space changed or operated at the ground level over a long period of time. Just to give one example, now, there were improvement trusts in all the presidency towns of British India. In Madras, there was an improvement trust. In Calcutta, there was an improvement trust. In Bombay, also there was an improvement trust. Now, between the improvement trusts, if we compare between the improvement trusts in Bombay and Calcutta, the property regimes were different. Bombay was part of the Ratwari settlement, where the government could go into a direct negotiation with the private citizens because the government was collecting the revenue directly from the private citizens. On the other hand, Calcutta was permanently settled. It was part of the permanent settlement of Bengal. Now, there, the government could not go into a direct arrangement when it came to issues of urban expansion or improvement, where they were needed to when the government needed to buy properties from the private citizens. They could not go directly to the private citizens because there was a mediator in the form of the landlord in case of Calcutta. So this difference between the two property regimes actually played a very important role, and there are now writings on this, especially on the Bombay Improvement Trust. Is of course Prashant Kidambi's writing, and Calcutta Improvement Trust, Ritojiti Bandyopadhyay, who I think will be teaching in this course at some later date, he has also written on this. So this difference has been pointed out by the first chairman of the Calcutta Improvement Trust, C.H. Bompas himself. When he was asked about the delay in improvement activities in Calcutta, he said it's happening because the property regime in Calcutta is different from Bombay, and our experiences are not matching, and therefore it's taking longer time to actually initiate urban improvement. Now, this is just one small example how property regimes within the urban space, or within any space for that matter, actually plays a very important role in deciding the direction and the orientation of improvement. Now, the final question which I would like to ask, this is not something that actually I have an answer to, but I think the the framework of rent, as a machinery, as a network of extraction of surplus value, can be used in this context also to conceptualize infrastructure as well. So one thing I think which Himanshu was talking about is a very interesting shift that happened from public work to private infrastructure, how private companies got involved, or how private companies are now getting more and more involved in infrastructure development, rather than before the PWD, the Public Works Department, was used to play the more important role. Now, this shift from public works, this shift from a property regime which was more oriented towards the public to a property regime which is more oriented towards private citizenship, private ownership, is itself an interesting site where one can map the history of how the concept and the practices of infrastructure building changed over the last 30 years, especially since the time of the liberalization of the Indian economy. That is one idea that I have. The other thing which I was thinking about when I was listening to Himanshu's lecture is that something that we talk about it, and there are more interesting studies that are now coming up, is the bureaucracy of land, and how that bureaucracy in fact engenders lots of social relationships of who is going to get access, who is not going to get access to certain resources. And if you think about it right now at a global level, access to natural resources, and certain natural resources are becoming much more valuable than they used to be. Water and air, the two prime examples. Now, of course, we are getting a sense that in the future, a fight over the access to natural resources is going to be probably the biggest fight, the biggest war that's going to happen. Now, in that moment, I think, even when we're talking about infrastructure, we probably need to think that how implicitly in the bureaucratic, in the governmental, as well as private understandings of infrastructure, this question of limited access on the basis of how the conceptualization of the property regimes would happen in future and is happening or is going through changes right now, how that would determine very important questions of the survival of the species maybe in future. So this is something that I would like to end my talk with. And thank you again for this opportunity